They murdered her squad and left her for dead in a bombed factory. The enemy fighters celebrated their victory and planned their escape. What they didn't know was that Captain Santos was still breathing, still armed and very, very angry. 12 men would pay for that mistake. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. The explosion threw Captain Maria Santos 30 feet through the air, her body slamming into the concrete wall of a destroyed building with bone-crushing force. Blood ran down her face from a deep gash above her left eye, and her right arm hung at an unnatural angle. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear voices speaking in a language she recognized as Chechen. "Is she dead?" one voice asked in accented English. "Must be. No one survives that close to a grenade blast," another replied. "Leave her. We have the intel we came for." Maria forced herself to remain perfectly still as Boots approached her position. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to fight, to defend herself. But years of special operations training had taught her that sometimes survival meant playing dead until the moment was right. The mission had gone wrong from the beginning. Intelligence reports had indicated that the weapons cache in this abandoned factory complex outside Grozny contained only a skeleton security force. Instead, Maria's 4-person team had walked into a trap. Sergeant Williams, Corporal Jackson, and Private Martinez, all dead within the first 5 minutes of contact. She had watched them fall one by one while trying to complete the mission and call for extraction. Now she was alone, injured, and deep in enemy territory with no communication and no backup coming. The Chechen separatists who had ambushed her team believed she was dead, which gave her exactly one advantage: the element of surprise. "Take what we can carry," the leader commanded. "Burn the rest. Make sure there's nothing left for the Russians to find." Maria counted at least 6 distinct voices, possibly more. Through barely opened eyes, she watched Boots moving around the concrete room where explosive charges had been placed. They were thorough, professional. This wasn't a ragtag militia. These were experienced fighters who knew their business. Pain shot through her ribs with each shallow breath. At least 2 were cracked, possibly broken. Her right shoulder was dislocated, and the gash on her forehead needed immediate attention to stop the bleeding. But she was alive, conscious, and armed. The Glock 19 on her hip had somehow survived the blast, though her primary weapon was nowhere to be seen. The voices began to fade as the enemy team moved toward the exit. Maria waited another full minute, counting her heartbeats before allowing herself to move. Every muscle in her body protested as she slowly rolled onto her side and assessed her situation. The factory floor was littered with debris from the explosion: twisted metal, chunks of concrete, and the scattered remains of wooden crates that had once contained weapons and ammunition. Her team's bodies lay where they had fallen, and Maria felt a cold rage building in her chest as she looked at her fallen comrades. Williams had been with her for 3 years, since her first deployment to Afghanistan. Jackson was 22 years old with a wife and newborn daughter back in Georgia. Martinez had been 2 weeks away from rotating home after his second tour. Good soldiers, good men, dead because someone had leaked their mission details to the enemy. Maria forced herself to focus on immediate priorities: medical attention, weapons, and communication. The enemy team was moving away from the factory, but they would likely establish security positions and might return to ensure the site was completely destroyed. Using her good arm, she dragged herself behind a pile of rubble that would provide concealment and began field treating her injuries. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp cuts always bled heavily. She used strips torn from her uniform to create a pressure bandage and stop the bleeding. The dislocated shoulder was more serious. Without proper medical equipment, there was only one way to deal with it. Maria braced her feet against a concrete block, gripped her wrist with her good hand, and pulled while rotating her arm. The joint popped back into place with an audible click and a wave of agony that made her bite down on her sleeve to avoid crying out. 2 hours after the ambush, Maria was mobile again. Her right arm was weak but functional, secured in an improvised sling. The head wound had stopped bleeding, and the broken ribs were taped as well as possible under field conditions. She had salvaged a radio from Jackson's body, though it appeared damaged. Her sidearm was functional with 2 spare magazines, 45 rounds total. Most importantly, she had retrieved her most valuable asset, the small, encrypted device that contained the real reason for their mission. The weapons cache had been secondary. The primary objective was recovering intelligence about planned terrorist attacks on American soil, intelligence that was now secured in the device clipped to her vest. As twilight fell over the Chechen landscape, Maria began her hunt. The enemy team had established a temporary camp 2 kilometers from the factory, in the ruins of what had once been a small village. Maria observed them for an hour through a scope salvaged from William's rifle, noting their positions, their patrol patterns, and their equipment. 12 fighters total, well-armed and disciplined. Under normal circumstances, a single operator against 12 would be suicide. But these weren't normal circumstances. These men had killed her team, stolen American intelligence, and left her for dead. They had made one critical mistake. They had failed to confirm the kill. Maria's first target was a sentry positioned on the north side of the camp, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20. He sat behind a pile of rubble with an AK-47 across his knees, more focused on the cigarette he was smoking than on maintaining proper security. She approached from his blind spot, moving with the patient stealth that had made her one of the Army's most effective special operations soldiers. The attack was swift and silent, a knife blade across the throat followed by a controlled descent to prevent the body from making noise as it fell. 1 down. 11 to go. The second elimination came 20 minutes later. Another sentry, this one older and more experienced, but still vulnerable to a patient stalker who knew how to use darkness and terrain. Maria came up behind him as he relieved himself behind a wall, the same knife ending his life before he could raise an alarm. 2 down, 10 to go. By midnight, Maria had eliminated 4 members of the enemy team without raising an alarm. Each kill was calculated, silent, and designed to gradually reduce their numbers while maintaining the element of surprise. She was operating on adrenaline and fury, her injuries forgotten in the cold mathematics of combat. The 5th kill changed everything. Maria was positioning herself for another silent elimination when the target turned at the wrong moment. He saw her approaching and opened his mouth to shout a warning. Her knife took him in the chest, but not before he managed a strangled cry that echoed across the camp. Instantly, the remaining fighters went to high alert. Voices shouted in Chechen as they grabbed weapons and took defensive positions. Flashlights swept the area where their comrade had fallen, and Maria found herself pinned behind inadequate cover with angry enemies closing in from 3 directions. This was no longer a stealth operation. This was survival combat at its most brutal. Maria's first shot took down a fighter who had approached too close to her position. The muzzle flash gave away her location, and immediately the night erupted with automatic weapons fire. Bullets sparked off rocks and whined through the air as she rolled to new cover. The firefight lasted 15 minutes, a brutal exchange of gunfire in the darkness. Maria used every piece of cover, every shadow, every technique she had learned in a decade of special operations. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting injured. But she had advantages her enemies didn't: superior training, intimate knowledge of small unit tactics, and the desperate fury of someone with nothing left to lose. When the shooting stopped, 6 more enemy fighters lay dead. Maria had taken a bullet through her left thigh and another had grazed her shoulder. But she was still mobile and still fighting. 3 enemies remained alive, and they had learned to respect the woman they had thought was dead. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when Maria eliminated the 8th fighter. He had been trying to flank her position, moving carefully through the rubble of a destroyed house. Maria tracked him patiently through her scope until he exposed himself for a clear shot. The bullet took him center mass and he dropped without a sound. 8 down, 4 to go. The remaining fighters had regrouped in a defensive position near the center of the village. They knew they were facing a professional, and they were no longer taking chances. Radio chatter indicated they had called for reinforcements, but Maria knew it would take hours for help to arrive. She didn't plan to give them hours. The 9th elimination required patience and precision. One of the remaining fighters had taken position in a partially collapsed building, using the elevated position to provide overwatch for his comrades. Maria spent 2 hours working her way into position, moving from cover to cover while avoiding the fields of fire from the other 3 enemies. The shot was difficult, nearly 300 meters through a gap in the rubble, with a target that was mostly concealed. Maria controlled her breathing, accounted for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The fighter slumped forward and didn't move again. 9 down, 3 to go. By noon of the second day, Maria had been fighting continuously for nearly 20 hours. Blood loss from her wounds was making her lightheaded, and exhaustion was beginning to affect her judgment. But she couldn't stop, not when she was this close to completing her mission. The 10th kill came during a brief firefight when one of the remaining enemies tried to change positions. Maria caught him in the open and put 2 rounds center mass before he could reach cover. His body fell in the street between 2 buildings, visible to his surviving comrades as a reminder of what happened to those who underestimated the woman they had failed to kill. 10 down. 2 to go. The final 2 fighters were the most dangerous, the unit leader and his lieutenant, both experienced professionals who understood they were facing someone exceptional. They had taken defensive positions in a stone building that provided excellent cover and multiple escape routes. Maria studied the building for an hour, noting every window, every door, every possible approach. These men weren't going to make mistakes, and she couldn't afford to either. Her ammunition was running low, fewer than 10 rounds remaining, and her injuries were beginning to seriously affect her performance. The 11th elimination required psychological warfare as much as marksmanship. Maria began a systematic campaign of harassment, taking shots at the building to keep the enemies pinned down, while gradually working closer to their position. She wanted them tired, stressed, and prone to making errors. The plan worked. After 3 hours of intermittent fire, one of the fighters lost patience and exposed himself while trying to get a better shooting position. Maria's bullet found its mark, and the man fell backward into the building. 11 down, 1 to go. The final enemy was the unit leader, a grizzled veteran who had survived years of warfare in the Caucasus Mountains. He was too experienced to be drawn out by harassment, too careful to make elementary mistakes. Maria realized she would have to go in after him. The final confrontation took place inside the stone building as the sun was setting on the 2nd day. Maria entered through a window, moving carefully through rooms filled with debris and shadows. She could hear her enemy breathing somewhere in the darkness, as aware of her presence as she was of his. They found each other in what had once been the building's main room. 2 warriors, both wounded, both at the limits of their endurance, facing each other across 10 feet of rubble-strewn floor. The Chechen fighter raised his rifle at the same moment Maria brought up her pistol. 2 shots fired simultaneously. The enemy's bullet passed so close to Maria's head that she felt the heat of its passage. Her bullet took him center mass and he fell backward against the wall. 12 down. Mission complete. Maria stood in the silence that followed, swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. Around her lay the evidence of 48 hours of continuous combat, spent brass, bloodstains, and the bodies of 12 enemy fighters who had underestimated a woman they thought they had killed. But the mission wasn't finished. Maria still had to extract herself from enemy territory and deliver the intelligence that had cost her team their lives. Using the enemy's radio equipment, she transmitted a coded message to her unit's emergency frequency, providing her location and requesting immediate extraction. The rescue helicopter found her 3 hours later, sitting calmly beside the bodies of her enemies with the encrypted intelligence device in her lap. The pilot later said it was one of the most surreal sights of his career. A single American soldier surrounded by the aftermath of what appeared to be a small war. During the medical evacuation, as field medics worked to stabilize her injuries, Maria finally allowed herself to think about something other than survival and mission completion. Williams, Jackson, and Martinez were dead, but their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The intelligence they had died retrieving would prevent terrorist attacks that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. The official after-action report listed Captain Maria Santos as killed in action during the initial ambush, then later amended to show her as wounded but successful in mission completion. The details of what happened during those 48 hours were classified at the highest levels, shared only with a handful of senior officers who needed to understand what one highly trained soldier could accomplish when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Maria spent 6 weeks recovering in a military hospital in Germany, undergoing surgery to repair the damage from multiple gunshot wounds and the injuries sustained in the initial explosion. Physical therapy was long and painful, but she was determined to return to active duty. The psychological evaluation was more challenging than the physical recovery. Military psychiatrists struggled to understand how someone could function at such a high level for so long, under such extreme stress. Maria's explanation was simple. She had a job to do, and she had done it. 6 months later, Captain Santos was back in the field, leading a new team in operations that officially never happened. She carried photos of Williams, Jackson, and Martinez in her equipment, a reminder of the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with surviving when others didn't. The enemy fighters who had ambushed her team had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had confused being overwhelmed with being defeated. They had mistaken temporary unconsciousness for death. Most importantly, they had failed to understand that some people become more dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. In the years that followed, Maria's 48 hours in Chechnya became a case study in military academies around the world. Not for the tactics she employed, though. Those were certainly noteworthy, but for the mindset that allowed her to continue fighting when any reasonable person would have given up. The lesson wasn't about superior weapons or advanced technology. It was about the power of human determination when channeled through proper training and unshakable moral conviction. It was about what happens when someone who has dedicated their life to protecting others faces those who would do them harm. They thought they had killed her. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. A highly trained professional with a mission to complete and the skills necessary to complete it. Regardless of the odds, 12 enemies eliminated in 48 hours. One mission completed against impossible odds. One lesson learned by those who would threaten American interests. Never assume someone is dead until you've confirmed it personally. And never, ever underestimate what a single determined warrior can accomplish when the stakes are measured in lives. Rather than politics, the official record shows that Captain Maria Santos completed her mission and returned safely to friendly forces. What the record doesn't show is that sometimes the most important victories are won not by armies or airstrikes, but by individuals who refused to quit when quitting would be the reasonable thing to do. They thought they killed her. They were wrong.